Hey, it's V back again today, and I've finally finished reading the second book in the Invisible Library series. So this book is called The Masked City by Genevieve Cogman. As a quick refresher, the Invisible Library is this library that exists in the spaces between different parallel universes, and it kind of acts as a sort of glue that holds all these worlds together and keeps them stable. At least that's kind of what they say about themselves, though whether or not that's true is a little harder to prove. The main character, Irene, is a librarian for this library, and at the end of the previous book she became appointed as the librarian in residence in an alternate version of Victorian London. So her job is to basically carry out the library's interests, I guess, in this world, which generally includes collecting rare works of fiction. This particular story begins when Irene gets a really cryptic warning from someone called Lord Silver, which is a fae that she has been dealing with relatively frequently, and shortly afterward her apprentice Kai gets kidnapped. Kai, in addition to being her apprentice, happens to be a dragon with ties to their dragon royal family, and this sends Irene on a rescue mission into worlds that are heavily dominated by the Fae, specifically an alternate version of Venice where it's always carnival in order to rescue him and to prevent a war from breaking out between the Fae and dragons. So I guess you could say that Fae and dragons are two really major types of non-humans in this book. Like, they have other things too, but these particular species are the ones that can actually move across worlds and have a big influence on the worlds in which they exist. The Fae tend to represent chaos, whereas the dragons tend to represent order. And you get to learn a little bit more about both of these species in this book. So something I liked about this book was Irene's cleverness. Like, I kind of liked seeing her ingenuity in the way that she used her own magic as well as the magic that exists in Fae worlds to help her in her rescue mission. So just to recap, Irene as a librarian has access to what they just call the language, where she can tell the world, I guess, or different pieces of the world to be a certain way for a short time. So for instance, she can tell someone's shoelaces to tie themselves together, or tell wine to boil. Like, she can affect inanimate things easily. Like, she can also influence living things, but only for a much shorter amount of time, and of course there are some ethical issues. Then there's Fae magic, which tends to involve the use of stories. So you know how a lot of times things like fairy tales and folk tales kind of expect stories to go a certain way, like there's certain conventions in these stories, and Fae magic, it's not so much that things have to happen a certain way, but things happen more easily when you adhere to certain story conventions, and Irene takes advantage of this in order to carry out her rescue, and that was just really creative of her, and I guess kind of fun to watch. So something I did not like, though, was, like I said before, since it was an undercover enemy territory type story, I think there were a lot of little bits that I found a little bit too stressful or a little bit too embarrassing. Like, it wasn't quite as bad as I was expecting, but there were still bits that just made me not entirely comfortable, I suppose. And I also didn't really like the way it began. Like, I mentioned that it began with Kai getting kidnapped, and I felt a little like it mostly happened because he was arrogant and careless, and I think that kind of annoyed me, so much so that I technically started reading this story back when I finished book 1, but because of the way it started, I ended up putting the book down and not getting back to it for like 6 months.